The gunshot echoed across the valley as Margaret Oliver's trembling hands lowered her father's hunting rifle. The rattlesnake that had nearly struck lay dead in the dust, its menacing rattle silenced forever. At 20 years old, Margaret Maggie, to those who knew her well, had developed the kind of sharp instincts necessary for survival in Colorado Territory. 1876. What she hadn't expected was that killing a snake would be far easier than defying her father's will, a challenge she would face before the sun set on Oroville that very day. The rugged mining town of Oroville, Colorado, nestled between towering mountains, had been Maggie's home for all her life. The settlement had grown from a handful of prospectors' tents to a proper town with a main street. Several businesses and families who had decided to put down roots in the promising silver boom region. The Oliver family had been among the first settlers, establishing themselves as one of the wealthiest families when Richard Oliver's mining investments paid off handsomely. Maggie's boots kicked up dust as she made her way back to the sprawling two-story house that overlooked the town. The white clapboard structure with its wraparound porch and ornate trim stood as a testament to her father's success and ambition. As she approached, she spotted her mother's figure waiting anxiously on the porch, hands clasped at her waist. Margaret Elizabeth Oliver. Her mother's voice carried the sharp edge of worry. "Where have you been? Mr. Harrington is expected for dinner in less than 2 hours, and you're traipsing about in those filthy trousers," Maggie sighed, tucking a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "I was checking the south property line like Father asked, nearly stepped on a rattler." Her mother's expression softened momentarily before hardening again. "Well, thank the Lord you're safe. Now hurry inside and prepare yourself. This dinner is of the utmost importance." The importance wasn't lost on Maggie. For weeks, her father had been dropping hints about Harold Harrington, the 45-year-old owner of the largest silver mine in the region. A widower 3 times over, Harrington had made his interest in Maggie known to her father, who saw the potential match as a way to secure the Oliver family's standing and expand their holdings. Upstairs in her bedroom, Maggie reluctantly allowed her mother to help her into a corseted blue silk dress that made breathing a challenge and movement nearly impossible. As her mother arranged her hair in an elaborate style, pinning and tucking until her scalp ached, Maggie stared at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The young woman staring back seemed a stranger, polished, pristine, and utterly miserable. "You look beautiful," her mother said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Mr. Harrington will be most impressed." "Mother," Maggie began carefully, "I have no desire to marry Mr. Harrington." Eleanor Oliver's lips thinned to a tight line. "Marriage isn't about desire, Margaret. It's about security and position. Your father has worked tirelessly to elevate this family, and this match will cement our place in society." "He's older than Father," Maggie protested. "Age brings wisdom and stability. His 3 wives all died under suspicious circumstances." Her mother waved a dismissive hand. "Mining accidents and childbirth take many. Don't listen to town gossip. I don't love him. I don't even like him." Eleanor's expression softened as she placed her hands on Maggie's shoulders. "Love grows with time, dear. My own marriage to your father began as a business arrangement between families. Look at us now, 23 years, and a beautiful daughter." Maggie wanted to point out that her parents' relationship could hardly be called affectionate. Her father ruled the household with stern authority, and her mother had long ago surrendered any notion of independence. That was not the future Maggie envisioned for herself. The dinner that evening unfolded exactly as Maggie had dreaded. Harold Harrington arrived dressed in an expensive suit that strained against his corpulent frame. his ruddy complexion suggesting an overindulgence in whiskey long before he arrived at their table. Throughout the meal, his small eyes rarely left Maggie, examining her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Your daughter is a vision, Richard," Harrington commented between bites of roast beef. "You've raised her well." Richard Oliver nodded in satisfaction. "Margaret has been educated in all the proper ways of running a household. She'll make someone a fine wife." The implication hung heavy in the air as Maggie pushed food around her plate, appetite gone. "I understand she's quite the horsewoman as well," Harrington continued. "I appreciate a woman who can ride. My estate is extensive, and a wife should be able to traverse it." "Margaret has always had a special way with horses," Eleanor offered, smiling tightly at her daughter. "Though perhaps with marriage she'll develop more ladylike interests." Harrington's laugh boomed across the table. "Oh, I wouldn't want to tame her spirit entirely, just enough to ensure she understands her place." Maggie's fork clattered against her plate. 3 sets of eyes turned to her. "Are you well, Margaret?" her father asked, his tone carrying a warning. "Perfectly fine, father," she managed, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "May I be excused for a moment?" Without waiting for permission, she rose and retreated to the kitchen, where she gripped the edge of the counter, drawing deep breaths until the room stopped spinning. The cook, Mrs. Pemberton, gave her a sympathetic look, but wisely remained silent. When Maggie returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved to business. Her father and Harrington were discussing the terms of a partnership that would combine their mining interests with Maggie as the ceiling element of the deal. After dessert was served and the brandy poured, her father cleared his throat. "Margaret, Mr. Harrington has something he wishes to discuss with you." Harrington set down his glass and turned to her with what he clearly believed was a charming smile. "Miss Oliver, I have spoken with your father and secured his permission to ask for your hand in marriage. You would want for nothing as my wife. My home is the finest in the territory, and my business interests continue to grow. You would hold an enviable position in society." The room fell silent as all eyes turned expectantly to Maggie. Her throat felt dry, her palms damp with sweat beneath her lace gloves. "Mr. Harrington," she began carefully, "I am flattered by your proposal. However, I must decline." The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother gasped softly, while her father's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. "I beg your pardon," Harrington said, clearly unaccustomed to rejection. "I cannot marry you, sir. I do not wish to marry at this time." Richard Oliver set down his brandy glass with controlled precision. "Margaret, perhaps you misunderstood. Mr. Harrington is offering you a most advantageous match." "I understand perfectly, father," Maggie replied, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed. "And my answer remains no." "This is not a request," her father said, his voice dangerously low. "This marriage will proceed. The arrangements have already been discussed." "You arranged my marriage without my consent." Maggie's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "As your father, I don't require your consent. I require your obedience." Richard's tone left no room for argument, yet Maggie couldn't back down now. "I will not marry a man 3 times my age, father, especially one with a reputation for mistreating his workers and his previous wives." Harrington slammed his palm on the table, rattling the china. "You would do well to watch your tongue, girl. Such accusations are not becoming in a future wife." "I am not, nor will I ever be your wife, Mr. Harrington." Richard Oliver stood abruptly. "Mr. Harrington, I apologize for my daughter's appalling behavior. Perhaps you would enjoy a cigar in my study while I have a private word with Margaret." After Harrington departed with a final glare in Maggie's direction, Her father turned to her, fury evident in every line of his face. "You will go to your room and consider the consequences of your actions. When Mr. Harrington leaves, we will discuss your future. You will either accept this match or face the consequences." What consequences could be worse than being sold like cattle to a man who treats women as possessions? Maggie challenged, rising to her feet. Her father's hand struck her cheek before she could react, the force of the blow sending her stumbling backward. Her mother's soft cry of distress barely registered through the ringing in her ears. "Richard," Eleanor gasped. "Be silent," he snapped at his wife before turning back to Maggie. "Go to your room. Now." Maggie pressed her hand to her stinging cheek, tears threatening but held in check by pride and anger. She turned and left the dining room, climbing the stairs with as much dignity as she could muster. In her room, she paced like a caged animal, touching her cheek where a bruise was already forming. Her father had been stern throughout her life, but never had he struck her. The line had been crossed, and Maggie knew with sudden clarity that she could never again see her parents in the same light. Hours later, when the house had gone quiet and Harrington had departed, her father summoned her to his study. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of brandy as she entered. "Your behavior tonight was unforgivable," he began without preamble. "You have embarrassed this family and jeopardized a valuable business arrangement." "Is that all I am to you?" "A business arrangement?" Maggie asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "You are my daughter, and you will do as I say." "Mr. Harrington is still willing to proceed with the marriage, despite your disgraceful display. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks' time." Maggie felt cold determination replace her earlier fear. "No, father, I will not marry him." Richard Oliver's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have 2 choices, Margaret. You will marry Harold Harrington and secure this family's future, or you will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back, disowned and disinherited." "Richard, surely." Her mother began from the doorway. "Silence, Eleanor. The girl must learn her place." He turned back to Maggie. "Well, what is your decision?" Maggie straightened her spine, meeting her father's gaze directly. "I choose freedom." For a moment, shock registered on her father's face before it hardened into cold fury. "Then you are no longer my daughter. You have until dawn to gather your belongings and leave. After that, you will not be welcome in this house or acknowledged by this family again." Her mother's soft sob from the doorway tore at Maggie's heart, but she kept her head high. "Very well. Good night, father." The night passed in a blur of activity as Maggie packed her most practical belongings. The fine dresses would be useless where she was going, wherever that might be. Instead, she packed her riding clothes, a few simple dresses, her mother's old medical book, and the small amount of money she had saved over the years. As the eastern sky began to lighten, she slipped a folded note under her mother's door, tied her bundle to her saddle, and led her horse Willow quietly from the stable. Dawn was breaking over the mountains as Maggie rode away from the only home she had ever known, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. She had chosen freedom over security, and now she would face whatever consequences came with that choice. The early morning light painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink as Maggie guided Willow along the trail leading west out of Oroville. She had no clear destination in mind, only the certainty that she needed to put distance between herself and her father's reach. Harold Harrington was a powerful man with connections throughout the territory. If he decided to pursue her, she would need to be far away. After several hours of riding, the emotional and physical toll of the night began to catch up with her. She found a small stream where Willow could drink, and Maggie splashed the cool water on her face, wincing as her fingers brushed against the tender bruise her father's hand had left. "What now, Willow?" she murmured to the mare, who flicked an ear in her direction. "We need work and a place to stay." The next town on the trail was Silverdale, a day's ride away. It was smaller than Oroville, but far enough that news of her disgrace might not have traveled there yet. With renewed determination, Maggie mounted Willow and continued westward. The sun was high overhead when she spotted a lone rider approaching from the direction of Silverdale. Instinctively, she guided Willow off the main trail, concealing herself behind a stand of pine trees until she could determine whether the approaching stranger posed a threat. The rider was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn duster and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. He rode with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the saddle, his horse, a magnificent black stallion, responding to the slightest touch. Maggie remained hidden, watching as he drew closer. He didn't appear to be in any hurry, his posture relaxed as he scanned the trail ahead. When he was nearly parallel to her hiding spot, his head turned sharply in her direction. "I can see you behind those trees, miss," he called out, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I mean no harm, just passing through." Startled, Maggie hesitated before slowly guiding Willow back onto the trail. There was little point in hiding now, and if she intended to make her own way in the world, she would need to learn to navigate encounters with strangers. As she emerged, she got a better look at the rider. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, but his expression was open and friendly. "Good day," she greeted him cautiously, keeping Willow at a safe distance. "Good day to you," he replied, tipping his hat. His eyes briefly registered surprise as he noticed the bruise on her cheek, but he made no comment about it. "Xavier O'Malley," he introduced himself. "Most folks call me Zav." "Margaret Oliver," she responded before realizing she should have given a false name. If her father sent people looking for her, her real name would make her easy to track. "Headed to Silverdale?" he asked, gesturing down the trail. "Yes, is it far?" "About 4 more hours at an easy pace." He studied her for a moment, his gaze taking in her travel-worn appearance and the single pack tied to her saddle. "Forgive me for saying so, Miss Oliver, but you look like you've been riding since dawn." "I have," she admitted, seeing no reason to lie about that much. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I was just heading back that way myself. If you'd like company on the trail, I'd be happy to ride alongside you. Or if you prefer to travel alone, I understand that too." Something about his straightforward manner put Maggie at ease. He was offering companionship without presumption, and after the events of the previous night, his respectful approach was a welcome change. "I wouldn't mind the company, Mr. O'Malley." "Just Zav, please." He smiled, the expression transforming his rugged features. "Shall we continue then?" "There's a nice spot about an hour ahead where we can rest the horses and have a bite to eat, if you're amenable." Maggie nodded, and they set off side by side. For a while, they rode in companionable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats of their horses and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. "So, Miss Oliver—" "Maggie, please," she interrupted. If they were to dispense with formalities, it should go both ways. "Maggie," he corrected with a nod. "What brings you to Silverdale, if you don't mind my asking?" She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm looking for work." "Any particular kind of work? Anything respectable that will provide room and board," she replied honestly. "I can cook, clean, tend horses, and I know basic nursing." Xavier glanced at her with newfound interest. "Nursing, you say? That's a valuable skill out here. Dr. Simmons in Silverdale has been looking for an assistant, His previous nurse moved east to be with family. Hope flickered in Maggie's chest. Do you think he would consider someone without formal training? I learned from my mother and books. Worth asking, Xavier replied. Especially since the next qualified nurse would be coming from Denver, and that's if he could convince one to settle in a place like Silverdale. They reached the resting spot. Xavier had mentioned a small clearing beside a spring with enough grass for the horses to graze. He dismounted with fluid grace and came around to offer Maggie assistance, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. As they sat sharing the jerky and biscuits Xavier had in his saddlebags, Maggie found herself studying him covertly. There was something reassuring about his presence, steady and unpretentious. He spoke of Silverdale and its inhabitants with obvious affection, painting a picture of a close-knit community. "What do you do in Silverdale?" she asked, when there was a natural pause in the conversation. "I run a small ranch about 3 miles outside of town," he explained. "Nothing fancy, some cattle, horses I train and sell, a few crops. I do some scouting work for the army when they need someone who knows the territory." "You seem young to have your own ranch," Maggie observed. A shadow passed over Xavier's face. "It was my uncle's place. He took me in when I was 12 after my parents died of fever back east, taught me everything I know about ranching and horses. He passed 2 years ago, left it all to me." "I'm sorry for your loss," Maggie said softly, understanding the pain of losing family, albeit in a very different way. Xavier nodded in acknowledgement. "What about you? You're a long way from home alone." The directness of his question caught her off guard. She looked away, focusing on a distant ridge. "I left home, by choice. And that," he gestured toward the bruise on her cheek, "a parting gift from my father," she replied with more bitterness than she intended. "He arranged a marriage for me. I refused." Xavier's expression darkened momentarily. "I see." "No, you don't," Maggie said, surprising herself with her candor. "My father disowned me for refusing to marry a man 3 times my age with a reputation for cruelty. I chose freedom over security, and now I have to find my own way." "That took courage," Xavier said after a moment, his gray eyes holding hers with unexpected understanding. "More courage than many possess." They fell silent as they finished their meal, the weight of Maggie's confession hanging between them. As they prepared to continue their journey, Xavier helped her back onto Willow with the same respectful assistance he had shown earlier. "Silverdale isn't Oroville," he said as they set off again. "It's smaller, rougher around the edges, but the people are good and they look after their own. If you're willing to work hard, you'll find a place there." "Thank you," Maggie replied, touched by his encouragement. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Xavier smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. "I believe that, Miss Maggie Oliver. I surely do." The remainder of the journey passed more quickly, with Xavier pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the region. By the time the buildings of Silverdale came into view, Maggie felt a tentative optimism replacing the dread and uncertainty that had plagued her since leaving home. The town consisted of one main street with various businesses lining both sides: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, a blacksmith, and several other establishments necessary for frontier living. It was indeed smaller than Oroville, but as they rode in, Maggie noticed that the buildings were well maintained and the streets relatively clean for a mining town. "Dr. Simmons' office is there," Xavier said, pointing to a white clapboard building with a small sign identifying it as a medical practice. "Would you like me to introduce you?" Maggie hesitated, suddenly nervous about her prospects. "Perhaps I should find lodging first and make myself presentable." "Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house has reasonable rates," Xavier suggested, gesturing to a two-story building with a neat front garden. "She's a good woman, fair and kind. Tell her I sent you." They stopped in front of the boarding house, and Xavier dismounted before helping Maggie down from Willow. As her feet touched the ground, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary, and Maggie felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "Thank you for your kindness today, Mr. O'Malley Xav," she said, stepping back slightly. "I don't know how I would have fared without your guidance." "It was my pleasure, Maggie." His smile was warm and genuine. "I'll be in town for a couple more hours if you need anything. You can usually find me at the general store or the blacksmith's." With a tip of his hat, Xavier remounted his stallion and rode toward the blacksmith shop, leaving Maggie to face her new beginning with a mixture of trepidation and hope. Mrs. Wilson proved to be exactly as Xavier had described, a fair and kind woman in her 50s who asked few questions and offered a clean, modest room at a reasonable weekly rate. After washing away the dust of travel and changing into her simplest, most respectable dress, Maggie steeled herself to visit the doctor's office. Dr. Simmons was a surprisingly young man, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a thoughtful manner. He listened attentively as Maggie explained her limited medical knowledge and her eagerness to learn more. "Miss Oliver, qualified medical help is scarce in these parts," he said when she finished. "I can't offer much in the way of wages, but I can provide training and experience that would be valuable should you wish to pursue nursing further." "I would be grateful for the opportunity, Doctor," Maggie replied sincerely. "There's a small room at the back of the office that my previous assistant used," he continued. "It's humble but private, and it would reduce your expenses if you're interested." By sunset, Maggie had secured both employment and lodging, arranged to move her few belongings from Mrs. Wilson's to the doctor's office the next day, and found a stable for Willow at a fair monthly rate. As she walked back toward the boarding house for her final night there, she spotted Xavier emerging from the general store, his arms loaded with supplies. He saw her at the same moment, and his face broke into a smile that seemed to brighten the gathering dusk. "Maggie, how did it go with the doctor?" "I start tomorrow," she said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "He's even providing a room behind the office." "That's wonderful news," Xavier replied, his genuine pleasure in her good fortune touching something inside her. "I was heading to the cafe for supper before riding home. Would you care to join me to celebrate your new position?" Maggie hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." The cafe was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and lanterns casting a warm glow over the half-dozen occupied tables. Xavier led her to a corner table and pulled out her chair with an ease that spoke of good manners rather than formal training. Over a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Maggie found herself sharing more about her life in Oroville than she had intended: her love of horses, her mother's instruction in healing arts, her father's gradual transformation from stern but fair parent to unyielding patriarch as his wealth and influence grew. In turn, Xavier told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, the devastating fever that claimed his parents and younger sister, and his uncle's gruff but loving guardianship on the Colorado frontier. He spoke with passion about his ranch, his hopes to expand his horse breeding program, and his connection to the land. "You ever miss the East?" Maggie asked as they lingered over coffee. Xavier considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the memories of my family, but not the place itself. This is home now. The mountains, the open spaces, the freedom to build something of my own." He glanced up at her. "What about you? Will you miss Oroville?" "I'll miss my mother," Maggie admitted softly, "and some friends." But like you said, the freedom to build something of my own is worth the sacrifice." When the meal ended, Xavier insisted on paying, waving away Maggie's protests. "Consider it a welcome to Silverdale gesture," he said. "Besides, I'll expect the same courtesy when you're established and earning your own way." The comment, delivered with a warm smile, carried an implicit promise of future friendship that eased some of the loneliness Maggie had been fighting since leaving home. Outside the cafe, the night air had grown cool and stars blanketed the sky above the small town. Xavier walked beside her toward Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, their pace unhurried. "I usually come to town every Saturday for supplies," he said as they reached the front gate. "Perhaps I could call on you then. Show you more of Silverdale when you're not working. In Oroville, such an invitation would have required a chaperone and formal permission. Here, standing under the vast Colorado sky with a man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness, the old rules seemed distant and irrelevant." "I'd like that," Maggie replied. Xavier's smile deepened, creating creases at the corners of his storm-gray eyes. "Until Saturday, then." He reached for her hand, raised it briefly to his lips in a gesture both courtly and surprisingly intimate, then turned and walked back toward where his horse was tethered. Maggie watched him go, her hand tingling where his lips had brushed it, a strange fluttering sensation in her chest. For the first time since leaving home, she felt something beyond fear and determination, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps her choice had led her not just to freedom, but to something even more precious. The first week in Silverdale passed in a blur of activity for Maggie. Dr. Simmons proved to be an excellent teacher, patient with her questions and generous with his knowledge. The work was demanding. Frontier medicine meant treating everything from mining injuries to childbirth, often with limited supplies and facilities, but Maggie found herself thriving under the challenge. The small room behind the doctor's office was indeed humble, with just enough space for a narrow bed, a chest for her clothing, a small table and a chair. Yet it was clean and private, and most importantly, it was hers. Each night, Maggie would light the small lamp and add to the journal she had begun keeping, recording her experiences and thoughts as she forged her new life. The people of Silverdale were initially curious about the newcomer, but as Maggie assisted Dr. Simmons and proved her competence and discretion, they began to accept her presence. Women nodded greetings on the street, shopkeepers learned her name, and by Friday, Maggie had already been invited to join the church's ladies' sewing circle, an invitation she politely deferred until she was more settled. Through it all, thoughts of Xavier O'Malley drifted through her mind at unexpected moments. The memory of his smile, the steady warmth in his gray eyes, the respectful brush of his lips against her hand, all of it lingered like a pleasant dream. Several times, Maggie caught herself glancing out the doctor's front window when a rider passed, hoping to catch a glimpse of him in town on some errand. On Saturday morning, Maggie woke earlier than usual, taking extra care with her appearance. She washed her hair and arranged it in a simpler but more becoming style than the elaborate fashions her mother had insisted upon. The green cotton dress she chose was modest but flattering, with small pearl buttons that had been a gift from her mother years ago. Dr. Simmons noticed her special attention to her appearance, but made no comment beyond a knowing smile as they prepared the office for the day's patients. It was a relatively quiet morning. A child with a splinter, a minor with a persistent cough, and a pregnant woman coming for a routine check, and by noon, the doctor was shooing Maggie out the door. "It's a fine day, Miss Oliver, and you've earned some time to yourself," he insisted. "I can manage any emergencies that arise. Go explore your new home." Maggie had just stepped onto the boardwalk when she spotted Xavier riding into town, his black stallion distinctive even from a distance. Her heart quickened as he saw her and raised a hand in greeting, guiding his horse toward the medical office. "Good afternoon, Maggie," he called as he drew closer, his smile warming his entire face. "You look lovely today." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks at the simple compliment. "Dr. Simmons has given me the afternoon off." Xavier dismounted with his usual fluid grace. "Perfect timing, then. I've finished my errands early." He gestured toward the saddlebags on his horse. "I brought a picnic lunch, if you'd like to see a bit more of the area. There's a nice spot by the river just outside of town." The prospect of spending the afternoon in Xavier's company sent a thrill of anticipation through Maggie. In Oroville, an unchaperoned outing would have been scandalous, but here she was making her own choices and living by her own judgment. "I'd like that very much," she said. Xavier's face lit up at her acceptance. "Wonderful. Do you need to get anything from your room first?" "Just my shawl," Maggie replied. "It's right through here." Minutes later, they were riding side by side out of town, Willow seeming to enjoy the exercise as much as Maggie was enjoying the company. Xavier led them along a trail that followed the river, eventually stopping in a clearing shaded by cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The picnic Xavier had packed turned out to be quite substantial: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and even a small jar of honey. He spread a blanket on the grass and arranged the food with surprising care. "This is wonderful," Maggie said as they settled on the blanket. "I haven't had a picnic since I was a child." "My uncle used to say that food tastes better under an open sky," Xavier replied, offering her a plate. "I've found he was right about most things." As they ate, Xavier asked about her first week in Silverdale, listening with genuine interest to her descriptions of the work and the people she had met. In turn, he shared stories about his ranch and his horses, his face animated as he described a new foal born just days earlier. "You should come see the ranch sometime," he said. "It's not grand, but it's home, and I think you'd appreciate the horses." "I'd like that," Maggie replied, realizing how much she meant it. After the confines of her father's house and the small room behind the doctor's office, the thought of open spaces and horses to ride was deeply appealing. After they finished eating, Xavier suggested a walk along the riverbank. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground as they strolled side by side, occasionally their hands brushing accidentally, sending little sparks of awareness through Maggie each time. "May I ask you something personal?" Xavier said after they had walked in companionable silence for a while. Maggie nodded, curious about what he wanted to know. "The man your father wanted you to marry, was there more to your refusal than his age and reputation? Were you perhaps promised to someone else in your heart?" The question surprised her. "No, there was no one else. My father kept me rather sheltered. The suitable young men in Oroville were mostly interested in my father's money and position." She hesitated, then added honestly, "I always hoped to marry for love, as foolish as that might seem." "Not foolish at all," Xavier replied, his voice soft. "My parents had that kind of marriage. Even as a child, I could see the difference between them and other couples. They genuinely delighted in each other's company." He smiled at the memory. "I promised myself I'd never settle for less." They reached a bend in the river where a large boulder provided a natural seat overlooking the water. Xavier helped Maggie up, his strong hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he joined her on the sun-warmed stone. "What about you?" Maggie asked, curious now. "A successful rancher like yourself must have caught the interest of local young ladies." Xavier laughed, the sound rich and genuine. There aren't many eligible young women in Silverdale, and those who are here have mostly known me since we were children. Besides, ranching leaves little time for courting. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. Until recently, I hadn't met anyone who made me want to make the time. The implication in his words hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly but both acutely aware of its presence. Maggie found herself studying Xavier's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sun brought out gold highlights in his brown hair, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow that she hadn't noticed before. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, partly to break the charged silence and partly out of genuine curiosity. Xavier touched it reflexively. "Horse threw me when I was 15. I was showing off, trying to break a wild Mustang with less patience than sense. Uncle Thomas patched me up and then made me get right back on the horse, said fear left untended grows until it consumes you." He smiled at the memory. He was right about that too. The afternoon passed swiftly as they shared stories and discovered shared interests, a love of horses, a preference for mountains over plains, a fondness for thunderstorms viewed from safe shelter. When the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Xavier reluctantly suggested they head back to town. As they rode, Maggie found herself wishing the day didn't have to end. Xavier's company felt comfortable in a way she had rarely experienced, as if they had known each other far longer than a mere week. "Thank you for today," she said as they reached the edge of town. "It was perfect." Xavier's smile was warm. "For me as well." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said about visiting the ranch. Perhaps next Saturday if Dr. Simmons can spare you again." "I'd love that," Maggie replied, her heart lifting at the prospect of another day in his company. They rode to the stables where Willow was boarded, and Xavier insisted on seeing Maggie safely back to the doctor's office even though the distance was short. At the door, he took her hand in his touch gentle but sure. "Until next Saturday, then," he said, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Until then," she agreed, reluctant to withdraw her hand from his warm grasp. For a moment, it seemed Xavier might say something more, but instead, he raised her hand to his lips as he had done a week earlier, the gesture somehow both courtly and intimate. Then, with a final smile, he turned and walked back to where his horse waited. Maggie watched him go, her hand still tingling from his touch, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she entered her small room and lit the lamp, she realized that for the first time since leaving Oroville, she was looking forward to the future with something more than determination. She was looking forward to it with joy. The week leading up to her visit to Xavier's ranch seemed to crawl by for Maggie. Each day brought new patients and new medical knowledge, but her thoughts constantly drifted to gray eyes and a warm smile. Dr. Simmons noticed her distraction, but made no comment beyond an occasional knowing look when she glanced out the window at passing riders. On Thursday afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the medical office. Maggie was organizing supplies when the bell over the door jingled, and she turned to find her mother standing hesitantly in the doorway, looking travel-worn but determined. "Mother," Maggie gasped, nearly dropping the bandages she was holding. "How did you—" Eleanor Oliver stepped forward, removing her gloves. "Your note said you were heading west. I asked at every town along the trail until I found someone who recognized your description." Her eyes took in Maggie's simple dress and the medical office. "So this is where you've settled?" "Yes," Maggie replied, still stunned by her mother's appearance. "I work for Dr. Simmons. I've learned so much already." She hesitated, then asked the question foremost in her mind. "Does father know you're here?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "He believes I'm visiting my sister in Denver." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small pouch. "I brought you this. It's not much, but it's what I could set aside without your father noticing." Maggie accepted the pouch, feeling the weight of coins inside. "Thank you, but I don't need money. I'm earning my way here." "Keep it for emergencies," her mother insisted. Then, more softly, "I'm proud of you, Margaret. It took courage to do what you did." The words, so unexpected, brought tears to Maggie's eyes. Throughout her childhood, her mother had always deferred to her father's judgment, rarely expressing her own opinions or desires. This small act of rebellion, seeking out her disowned daughter against her husband's wishes, revealed a strength Maggie hadn't known her mother possessed. "I have a room here," Maggie said, gesturing toward the back of the office. "It's small, but we could share it tonight, and tomorrow I'll help you find accommodation at the boarding house." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "I can only stay 2 days. I must be back in Oroville before your father returns from his business trip to Denver." That evening, in the privacy of Maggie's small room, mother and daughter talked more openly than they ever had before. Eleanor shared stories of her own youth dreams she had set aside, a suitor she had loved but who lacked the fortune her parents demanded in a match, the gradual erosion of her spirit under Richard Oliver's controlling nature. "I allowed it to happen," she admitted as they sat on Maggie's narrow bed, their hands clasped. "Year by year, decision by decision, I surrendered my voice until I barely recognized myself. When your father struck you that night, I saw my entire married life in that single moment, and I saw your courage in refusing to accept the same fate." "Why didn't you come with me?" Maggie asked softly. Eleanor sighed, looking suddenly older. 23 years of marriage, of building a life, of allowing someone else to make your choices, it creates chains that are difficult to break. But seeing you here, making your own way, perhaps it's not too late for me to find some small independence of my own. The next day, Maggie introduced her mother to Dr. Simmons, who graciously offered Eleanor the use of his home's guest room rather than the boarding house, sensing the need for privacy in their reunion. While the doctor attended patients, Maggie showed her mother around Silverdale, introducing her to the shopkeepers and explaining her new life. They were returning from the general store when Xavier rode into town, immediately spotting Maggie on the boardwalk. His face lit up with his characteristic warm smile as he dismounted and approached them. "Good afternoon, Maggie," he greeted her before turning respectfully to Eleanor. "Madam." "Xavier, this is my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Oliver," Maggie said, noticing the way her mother assessed the handsome rancher with interest. "Mother, this is Xavier O'Malley. He owns a ranch outside of town and was kind enough to help me when I first arrived in Silverdale. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Oliver," Xavier said, tipping his hat. "Your daughter has become a valued member of our community in a very short time." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at the warmth in Xavier's voice when he spoke of Maggie. "Mr. O'Malley, I'm pleased to meet the man who showed kindness to my daughter when she needed it most." Xavier insisted on carrying their packages back to the doctor's office, and as they walked, Eleanor observed the glances exchanged between her daughter and the rancher with growing understanding. When they reached their destination, Xavier reminded Maggie of their plans for the following day. "I'll come by around 9 if that suits you," he said. "We can spend the day at the ranch and I'll have you back by nightfall." "That would be perfect," Maggie replied, aware of her mother's curious gaze. After Xavier departed, Eleanor gave her daughter a knowing look. "He seems like a good man." "He is," Maggie confirmed, unable to suppress a smile. "Honest and kind. And clearly smitten with you," her mother added perceptively. When Maggie started to protest, Alina raised a hand. "I raised you, Margaret. I know when you're developing feelings for someone, even if you're not ready to admit it to yourself." That evening, as they shared a final meal before Alina's departure the next morning, her mother presented her with a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought this for you," she said as Maggie carefully unwrapped it to reveal a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "It was my mother's and her mother's before that. Your father doesn't know I have it. I want you to have something of your heritage, something to remind you that you're not alone in the world, even if we're apart." Maggie fastened the locket around her neck, the weight of it unfamiliar but comforting. "Thank you, Mother. I'll treasure it." "One more thing," Alina said, her expression turning serious. "Harold Harrington has been making inquiries about you in nearby towns. Your father encourages it, hoping you'll be found and brought back to fulfill the arrangement. Be cautious, Margaret. Harrington is not a man accustomed to being denied what he wants." The warning cast a shadow over their farewell the next morning. As the stage coach prepared to depart, Alina embraced her daughter tightly. "Be happy, Margaret," she whispered. "Find the joy I was too afraid to seek." "I will," Maggie promised, brushing away tears. "And perhaps someday you'll find your own courage to join me." As the stage coach disappeared in a cloud of dust, Maggie fingered the locket at her throat, her mother's warning about Harrington mingling with anticipation of the day ahead with Xavier. Her new life contained both shadows and light, but for the first time, she felt equipped to face whatever came her way. Xavier arrived precisely at 9, looking particularly handsome in a clean blue shirt and his best Stetson. His face brightened when he saw Maggie waiting on the boardwalk, wearing her riding clothes and the new locket gleaming at her throat. "You look ready for adventure," he said, dismounting to help her onto Willow. "Did your mother depart safely?" "Yes, on the morning stage," Maggie replied, settling into the saddle. "Thank you for being so kind to her yesterday." "Of course," Xavier said simply, as if kindness were the most natural thing in the world. "She seems like a good woman." "She is," Maggie agreed, thinking of her mother's quiet strength. "Stronger than I realized." They rode side by side out of town, the morning sun warming their backs as Xavier led them westward along a trail that wound through pine forests and meadows bright with summer wildflowers. Their conversation flowed easily, Xavier pointing out landmarks, Maggie sharing anecdotes from her week at the doctor's office. After about an hour's ride, they crested a ridge and Xavier reined his horse to a stop, gesturing to the valley below. "Welcome to the Circle O Ranch." Maggie's breath caught at the view. Nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising behind it, the ranch was more extensive than she had imagined. A neat 2-story house of timber and stone anchored the property, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. A stream cut through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods. In the nearest corral, several horses raised their heads at their approach, nickering in greeting. "It's beautiful," Maggie said sincerely. "How much land do you have?" "About 2,000 acres, Xavier replied, pride evident in his voice. "Most of it grazing land extending back into those foothills. Uncle Thomas started with just 100 acres and a dream. We built the rest together, piece by piece." As they rode down into the valley, Maggie could see the care that had gone into the ranch. The buildings were well maintained, the fences straight and sturdy, the cattle healthy. Everything spoke of diligent stewardship and hard work. They were greeted at the main house by a middle-aged Mexican woman who emerged onto the porch wiping her hands on an apron. "Maggie, this is Mrs. Alina Vasquez," Xavier introduced them as they dismounted. "She's been keeping house for me since my uncle passed, along with her husband Miguel, who helps with the ranch. They live in the cottage just beyond the barn. Welcome, Miss Oliver, Elena said warmly. Xavier has told us much about you. Has he? Maggie asked, glancing at Xavier, who looked slightly embarrassed. All good things, Elena assured her with a knowing smile. Lunch will be ready at noon. I've made my special enchiladas. Elena's cooking is worth the ride alone, Xavier said as he helped Maggie tie Willow to the hitching post. But first, I thought you might like to see the horses, especially the new foal I mentioned. The barn was spacious and immaculate, with stalls lining both sides and a wide central aisle. Several horses peered out curiously as they entered, and Xavier introduced each one with obvious affection, explaining their lineage and training. In the largest stall at the far end, a magnificent bay mare stood protectively over a wobbly-legged foal with a distinctive white blaze on its forehead. This is Duchess, Xavier said, stroking the mare's neck. And her son, born just 8 days ago. He doesn't have a name yet. Maggie approached cautiously, letting Duchess sniff her hand before reaching out to touch the foal, who regarded her with liquid brown eyes. He's beautiful. Perfect proportions, strong legs. You know horses, Xavier observed, watching her skilled assessment. My father bred carriage horses, Maggie explained. I spent more time in the stables than in the house whenever I could manage it. She stroked the foal's silky neck. He looks like he'll have his mother's spirit and his sire's build. A fine combination. Would you like to name him? Xavier asked unexpectedly. Maggie looked up in surprise. Me? But he's your horse. I've been waiting for the right name to present itself, Xavier said with a shrug. Sometimes you just know when something fits. Maggie studied the foal, taking in his confident stance despite his youth, the intelligence in his eyes, the perfect star on his forehead. Orion, she said finally, for the constellation. That white mark looks like a star, and he seems destined for greatness. Xavier's smile was warm with approval. Orion it is, then. He reached out to stroke the foal's head. Welcome to the circle, O Orion. The simple act of naming the foal created an unexpected connection between them, a shared responsibility for a new life. As they continued their tour of the ranch, the corrals where Xavier trained horses, the fields where he grew hay and vegetables, the spring-fed pond where he said trout could be caught for dinner, Maggie felt herself drawn deeper into the rhythms and beauty of the place. Elena's lunch proved to be as delicious as promised: spicy enchiladas, fresh tortillas, and beans flavored with herbs from her garden. They ate on the porch, enjoying the mountain breeze and the view of the pastures. Miguel joined them briefly, a wiry man with a quick smile who clearly respected Xavier greatly. After lunch, Xavier suggested a ride to his favorite spot on the property. They saddled fresh horses. Willow deserved a rest. Xavier insisted and rode up into the foothills above the ranch. The trail climbed steadily through stands of aspen and pine until they reached a natural clearing on a promontory overlooking the entire valley. Uncle Thomas called this Thinking Rock, Xavier explained as they dismounted and approached a flat-topped boulder at the edge of the clearing. He said the view helped put problems in perspective. Maggie could understand why. From this height, the ranch spread out below them like a living map, and beyond it, the vast expanse of mountains and forests that made up this corner of Colorado territory. The sheer scale of the landscape made human concerns seem small and manageable. It's breathtaking, she said, settling beside Xavier on the sun-warmed stone. You're fortunate to call this place home. I know, he agreed softly. I never take it for granted. He hesitated, then added, after losing my family and being uprooted from everything familiar, finding a place to belong again felt like a miracle. Uncle Thomas gave me that gift. You must miss him, Maggie said. hearing the affection in Xavier's voice when he spoke of his uncle. "Every day," Xavier admitted. "He was a good man, tough but fair, generous in spirit if not in words. He taught me everything that matters: how to work hard, how to be honest, how to respect the land and the animals that share it with us." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching an eagle soar on thermal currents high above the valley. The peaceful moment was broken when Xavier suddenly tensed, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "What is it?" Maggie asked, trying to follow his line of sight. "Riders," Xavier said, pointing to a dust cloud on the trail leading to the ranch. "3 of them. I wasn't expecting visitors today." He stood, frowning slightly. "We should head back down." They rode swiftly back to the ranch, arriving just as 3 men on horseback approached the main house. Xavier's expression darkened as he recognized the lead rider, a tall man with a flamboyant mustache and expensive clothes that seemed out of place on the frontier. "Harold Harrington," Maggie whispered, her stomach clenching with dread. Her mother's warning had come true more quickly than she had feared. "You know him?" Xavier asked sharply. "He's the man my father wanted me to marry," Maggie replied, her hands tightening on the reins. "The one I refused." Understanding and concern flashed across Xavier's face. "Stay behind me," he said quietly as they approached the house. Harrington and his companions, 2 rough-looking men with the hard eyes of hired guns, had already dismounted and were standing in the yard when Xavier and Maggie rode in. Elena watched warily from the porch, while Miguel had emerged from a nearby shed, a pitchfork in hand. "Mr. O'Malley," Harrington called, his voice carrying the arrogant assurance of a man accustomed to power. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I'm here on important business." His gaze shifted to Maggie, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes spread across his face. "Ah, Miss Oliver, how fortunate to find you here. Your father has been most concerned about your welfare." Xavier dismounted smoothly, helping Maggie down before positioning himself slightly in front of her. "Mr. Harrington, I don't believe we've been introduced, yet you seem to know my name and have come onto my property uninvited." "Harold Harrington," the man replied with a slight bow that managed to be both formal and condescending. "I own the Silverton Mining Company in Oroville." "Richard Oliver is a business associate of mine," he gestured toward Maggie, "and his daughter is my fiancée." "That's not true," Maggie said firmly, stepping forward to stand beside Xavier. "I refused your proposal, Mr. Harrington, and my father disowned me as a result." "I am not your fiancé, nor will I ever be." Harrington's expression hardened. "A temporary misunderstanding, my dear. Your father and I have discussed the situation, and he's eager for you to return home and fulfill our arrangement." "I have no home in Oroville anymore," Maggie replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "I've built a new life here in Silverdale." "Working as a nurse's assistant and living in a back room," Harrington scoffed. "Hardly a fitting situation for a woman of your breeding and education." "As my wife, you would want for nothing." "Except freedom and respect," Maggie countered. "No amount of luxury would compensate for those." Xavier's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Harrington, Miss Oliver has made her position clear. I think it's time for you to leave." Harrington's gaze shifted to Xavier, assessing him with cold calculation. "This doesn't concern you, O'Malley. The girl belongs with her family and her fiancé." "The girl is standing right here," Maggie said sharply, "and I belong exactly where I choose to be." One of Harrington's men moved his hand to rest on the pistol at his hip, a subtle but clear threat that wasn't lost on Xavier. Miguel stepped closer, still holding the pitchfork, while Elena disappeared into the house, presumably to fetch a weapon. "I'd advise your men to keep their hands away from their guns," Xavier said calmly, though Maggie could see the tension in his shoulders. This is my property, and the only person who doesn't belong here is you." For a tense moment, it seemed Harrington might escalate the confrontation. Then, with a thin smile, he raised his hands in a gesture of false conciliation. "I see I've come at an inopportune time. Perhaps after Miss Oliver has had more opportunity to consider her situation and the concern of her family, she'll be more receptive." He turned to Maggie. "I'll be staying at the hotel in Silverdale for a few days. I hope we'll speak again under more favorable circumstances." With that, he remounted his horse, his men following suit. As they rode away, Harrington called back over his shoulder, "Remember, Margaret, a woman alone in the world, is vulnerable. I'm offering you protection and security. Don't be foolish enough to refuse it twice." Only when the riders had disappeared from view did Maggie realize she was trembling. Xavier turned to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Maggie nodded, though she felt anything but all right. "I knew he might come looking for me, but I didn't expect it so soon. My mother warned me yesterday that he had been making inquiries." Xavier's expression hardened. "The man is trouble. I could see it in his eyes and in the type of men he hires." He glanced toward where Alina and Miguel stood watching. "I don't like the idea of you returning to town while he's there." "I can't hide forever," Maggie pointed out. "I have responsibilities at the doctor's office, patients who need care." "At least stay here tonight," Xavier suggested. "Give me time to send word to Sheriff Barnes about Harrington's presence and his implied threats. Alina can prepare the guest room, and we'll take you back to town in the morning with proper escort." The idea of returning to Silverdale, where Harrington and his men might be waiting, made Maggie's stomach knot with anxiety. The ranch, with its space and solidity and Xavier's reassuring presence, felt like a sanctuary in comparison. "Thank you," she agreed. "That would be wise." The remainder of the afternoon passed in subdued activity. Xavier sent Miguel to town with a message for the sheriff, while Alina prepared the guest room and started dinner. Maggie found herself in the kitchen helping the housekeeper, finding comfort in the familiar tasks of chopping vegetables and kneading bread. "The boss is worried for you," Alina observed as they worked. "I have not seen him so concerned since his uncle fell ill." "I've brought trouble to his door," Maggie said regretfully. "I never intended that." Alina shook her head firmly. "Do not think such things. Xavier O'Malley is a good man who knows his own mind. If he chooses to stand with you, it is because he believes it is right." She gave Maggie a knowing look. "And perhaps because his heart speaks to him as well." Before Maggie could respond to this observation, Xavier appeared in the doorway. "Miguel just returned from town. Sheriff Barnes wasn't there. He's out tracking cattle rustlers and won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest. But Miguel left word with the deputy about our visitors." Dinner was a quiet affair, with the events of the day hanging over them. After the meal, Xavier suggested they sit on the porch to enjoy the evening air. As darkness fell, the valley below filled with shadows, while above them, stars emerged one by one in the vast Colorado sky. "I'm sorry about today," Xavier said after they had sat in silence for a while. "I wanted to show you the beauty of this place, not remind you of what you left behind." "None of this is your fault," Maggie replied. "And despite Harrington's appearance, today has been wonderful. Your ranch is everything you described and more." Xavier turned to look at her, his face partially illuminated by the lamp shining through the window behind them. "Maggie, I need to tell you something. When I first saw you on the trail that day, something inside me recognized you, not your face, which I'd never seen before, but something deeper. As if my soul knew yours." He paused, searching for words. "I know we've known each other only briefly, but these past 2 weeks have meant more to me than I can express." Maggie's heart quickened at his words, which echoed feelings she had been trying to understand herself. "I've felt it too," she admitted softly. "A connection I can't explain but can't deny either." Xavier reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "Whatever happens with Harrington, I want you to know that you're not alone, not anymore." The simple declaration, spoken with such sincerity, touched something deep within Maggie. After a lifetime of her father's control and the isolation of her recent choices, Xavier's unwavering support felt like a gift beyond measure. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching on the words. They sat hand in hand as the night deepened around them, the silence between them comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. When Xavier finally walked her to the guest room, he paused at the door, still holding her hand. "Sleep well, Maggie Oliver," he said softly. "You're safe here." As she closed the door behind her, Maggie realized that she did indeed feel safe, not just physically protected from Harrington, but emotionally secure in a way she had never experienced before. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she would face them knowing she was no longer alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no sign of Harrington or his men. After a hearty breakfast prepared by Alina, Xavier insisted on accompanying Maggie back to town, along with Miguel. The ride was uneventful, though Maggie found herself scanning the trail frequently, half expecting to see Harrington lying in wait. Dr. Simmons was waiting anxiously when they arrived at the medical office. "Miss Oliver, thank goodness you're safe. Mr. Harrington came by yesterday evening, asking most insistently about your whereabouts." "What did you tell him?" Xavier asked sharply. "That Miss Oliver's movements are her own business, and that as her employer I respect her privacy," the doctor replied firmly. He didn't care for that answer, but there was little he could do about it in a public setting. Sheriff Barnes had returned to town earlier than expected, and was in the process of interviewing Harrington at the hotel when Xavier, Maggie, and Miguel arrived. Xavier immediately headed to the sheriff's office to provide his account of the previous day's events, while Miguel took up a watchful position across the street from the medical office. The day passed tensely for Maggie as she attended to patients, constantly aware of Miguel's protective presence outside and the knowledge that Harrington was somewhere in town. Dr. Simmons insisted she stay in the treatment room rather than at the front desk, reducing her visibility to anyone passing by. Late in the afternoon, Xavier returned with Sheriff Barnes, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Miss Oliver," the sheriff greeted her, "I've had quite the interesting conversation with Mr. Harrington. He claims you're his fiancée, having run away after a lover's quarrel." "That's a lie," Maggie stated firmly. "I never agreed to marry him. My father arranged the match without my consent, and when I refused, he disowned me. I left Oroville of my own free will, and I have no intention of returning." Sheriff Barnes nodded thoughtfully. "That aligns more with the impression I got from observing the man. He's the type who considers people as possessions." He glanced at Xavier, then back to Maggie. "I've informed him that in Colorado territory, a woman of legal age cannot be forced into marriage against her will, nor can she be compelled to return to her family if she chooses independence." "How did he take that?" Xavier asked. "About as well as you'd expect," the sheriff replied dryly. "Made some threats about legal action, claimed influence with territorial authorities." He shrugged. "Maybe he has such influence in Oroville but not here. I've warned him against causing trouble in my town." "Will that be enough to deter him?" Dr. Simmons asked, concern evident in his voice. Sheriff Barnes's expression turned serious. "Hard to say. Men like Harrington aren't accustomed to being denied what they want." I've told him and his men to be on the morning stage out of Silverdale, but I'd advise caution until they're gone." He looked directly at Maggie. "It might be wise for you to stay somewhere other than your usual lodgings tonight, Miss Oliver. She can stay at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house," Xavier suggested. "I'll arrange it. And I'll have my deputy keep an eye on both the boarding house and the hotel tonight," Sheriff Barnes added, "just as a precaution." After the sheriff departed, Xavier turned to Maggie, his face etched with concern. "I don't like this, Maggie. Harrington strikes me as a man who doesn't accept defeat easily." "I know," she agreed, thinking of the cold calculation she had seen in Harrington's eyes. "But I can't let fear dictate my life. That's what I left Oroville to escape." Xavier nodded understanding, though worry still shadowed his expression. "At least let me escort you to the boarding house when you're finished here, and promise you'll be careful." As darkness fell over Silverdale, Maggie completed her tasks at the medical office and gathered a few essentials from her room. Xavier was waiting outside as promised, and they walked together to Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, acutely aware of the shadows that seemed to harbor potential threats. "I'll be nearby all night," Xavier assured her as they reached the boarding house. "Miguel is watching the hotel where Harrington is staying, and the deputy is patrolling the street." "You need rest too," Maggie protested. "You can't stay awake all night." "I've gone longer without sleep during calving season," Xavier replied with a small smile. "Your safety is more important than my rest." The sincerity in his voice touched Maggie deeply. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Xavier reached out to touch her cheek gently. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, Harrington will be gone, and this will all be behind us." But as Maggie prepared for bed in the sparse but comfortable room Mrs. Wilson had provided, she couldn't shake the feeling that Harrington's departure wouldn't be the end of the matter. Men like him didn't relinquish their prizes easily, especially when pride and business interests were at stake. Her concerns proved prophetic in the early hours before dawn. Maggie was awakened from a fitful sleep by the sounds of shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. Rushing to the window, she saw flames licking at the side of the building, while shadowy figures moved in the street below. "Fire! Everyone out!" Mrs. Wilson's voice carried up the stairs as she rushed to alert her boarders. Maggie quickly pulled on her dress, grabbed her small bag of possessions, and hurried downstairs. Outside, the pre-dawn air was filled with smoke and confusion as townspeople emerged from nearby buildings, some bringing buckets of water to fight the blaze that was rapidly engulfing one side of the boarding house. "Maggie." Xavier appeared through the smoke, his face streaked with soot. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine," she assured him. "What happened?" "Someone set the fire deliberately," Xavier said grimly, "and Harrington and his men are gone from the hotel." Sheriff Barnes pushed through the crowd toward them. "O'Malley, the fire at the livery started at almost the same time." "I think it's a diversion." Xavier's expression darkened with understanding. To draw attention away from, he grabbed Maggie's arm urgently. "We need to get you somewhere safe. Now." Before they could move, shots rang out from the direction of the church, sending people ducking for cover. In the ensuing chaos, Maggie felt strong hands grab her from behind, a cloth pressed roughly over her mouth and nose. She struggled, but the sickly sweet smell overwhelmed her senses, and darkness closed in despite her desperate fight to remain conscious. When Maggie awoke, her head pounding and mouth dry, she found herself in the back of a moving wagon, her hands and feet bound with rope. Through the canvas covering, she could see the first light of dawn breaking over unfamiliar terrain. They were traveling east back toward Oroville. "Ah, you're awake," Harrington's voice came from the front of the wagon. He glanced back at her, his expression a mixture of triumph and anger. I did warn you, Margaret. A woman alone in the world is vulnerable. Kidnapping is a crime, Harrington, Maggie said, her voice hoarse. Sheriff Barnes will come after you. By the time that small-town lawman figures out which direction we've taken, we'll be well into the next county, Harrington replied dismissively. And once we reach Oroville, your father's influence will ensure no questions are asked about our hasty wedding. I'll never marry you, Maggie declared, working subtly at the ropes binding her wrists. Not in Oroville or anywhere else. Harrington's laugh held no humor. You don't seem to understand your position, my dear. Your choices ended when you defied your father and me. Now, you'll do as you're told or face consequences far more unpleasant than a comfortable marriage to a wealthy man. Fear and anger warred within Maggie as she assessed her situation. The two hired men rode alongside the wagon, weapons clearly visible. Harrington himself drove the team, his back to her as they traveled along what appeared to be a little-used trail through rugged country. Escape seemed impossible, yet the thought of returning to Oroville as Harrington's unwilling bride was intolerable. They traveled through the morning, stopping briefly to water the horses at a small stream. Harrington untied Maggie's feet but kept her hands bound, allowing her only minimal privacy for necessary personal matters before forcing her back into the wagon. One of the men offered her a canteen and some jerky, which she accepted despite her revulsion at taking anything from her captors. She would need strength if an opportunity for escape presented itself. As the day wore on, Maggie noticed a change in the terrain. They were moving into more densely forested areas, the trail narrowing and becoming steeper. Her hopes rose slightly at the realization that they were taking a backwoods route rather than the main road, likely to avoid potential pursuit. It would slow their progress considerably, giving anyone searching for her more time to catch up, and she was certain Xavier would be searching. The thought of him gave her courage as the hours passed, and the wagon jolted over increasingly rough terrain. Xavier O'Malley was not a man who would abandon someone he cared about, especially not to a fate like the one Harrington intended for her. The sun was low in the western sky when Maggie heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching rapidly from behind them. Harrington and his men heard it too, the wagon slowing as they exchanged tense words. "Riders coming fast," one of the men reported, peering back down the trail. "At least 3, maybe more." "Find a defensive position," Harrington ordered sharply. "We'll deal with them and continue on." The wagon lurched off the trail into a small clearing surrounded by pine trees and boulders. The men quickly unhitched the horses and positioned themselves behind natural cover, rifles ready. Harrington dragged Maggie roughly from the wagon, keeping a tight grip on her arm. "Not a sound," he hissed, pressing the barrel of a pistol against her side. "Or I'll ensure your rancher friend regrets the day he met you." Maggie's heart leapt at the implication that Xavier was among the approaching riders. Hope and fear mingled as she heard the hoofbeats slow, then stop on the trail near the clearing. "Harrington," Xavier's voice rang out, confirming her hopes. "We know you're there. Release Miss Oliver and surrender yourself to the law." "You're trespassing, O'Malley," Harrington called back, keeping Maggie in front of him as a shield. "This is a private matter between myself and my fiancée." "A private matter that includes abduction, arson, and assault," Sheriff Barnes's voice joined Xavier's. "You've committed serious crimes in my jurisdiction, Harrington. There's no escaping the consequences." Harrington's grip tightened painfully on Maggie's arm. "I have the girl," he shouted, "and I'm quite prepared to ensure she doesn't leave this clearing alive if you don't back away now." "Is that what you want, O'Malley? Her blood on your hands?" There was a pause before Xavier replied, his voice controlled but edged with steel. If you harm her, Harrington, there won't be a place on earth where you can hide from me." The threat, delivered with such quiet certainty, sent a chill down Maggie's spine even as it bolstered her courage. She knew, with sudden clarity, that Xavier meant every word, and that knowledge gave her the strength she needed. Using techniques she had learned breaking spirited horses in her father's stables, Maggie went suddenly limp, dropping her full weight against Harrington's grip. The unexpected move caught him off balance, loosening his hold just enough for her to twist free. In the same motion, she drove her elbow hard into his stomach, sending him staggering backward with a surprised grunt of pain. "Xavier," she shouted, diving toward the cover of a nearby boulder as gunshots erupted from both sides. The clearing erupted in chaos as Sheriff Barnes and his men exchanged fire with Harrington's hired guns. Maggie pressed herself against the boulder, her bound hands making movement awkward as she sought safety from the flying bullets. Through the dust and gunsmoke, she caught glimpses of Xavier working his way toward her position, using trees and rocks for cover as he returned fire. One of Harrington's men fell with a cry, clutching his shoulder, while the other continued shooting from behind the wagon. Harrington himself had recovered from Maggie's blow and was now moving toward her, fury distorting his features as he raised his pistol. Before he could fire, a shot rang out from the edge of the clearing, and Harrington's weapon flew from his hand, accompanied by his howl of pain as blood spurted from his wounded fingers. Moments later, Xavier reached Maggie's side, sheltering her with his body as he quickly cut the ropes binding her wrists. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," she assured him, flexing her freed hands gratefully. "How did you find me so quickly, Mrs.?" "Wilson saw the men take you," Xavier explained tersely. "And Miguel followed their trail while I gathered the sheriff and his deputies." His expression hardened. "I would have found you if they'd taken you to the ends of the earth." The shooting had stopped, and Sheriff Barnes's authoritative voice carried across the clearing. "It's over, Harrington. Your men have surrendered. Throw down any weapons and come out with your hands raised." Harrington, nursing his bloodied hand, emerged from behind a tree, his earlier arrogance replaced by cold hatred as his gaze fell on Maggie and Xavier. "This isn't finished," he snarled. "Richard Oliver won't stand for his daughter living in sin with a nobody rancher. He'll see you both ruined." "My father disowned me," Maggie reminded him, standing tall beside Xavier. "He has no say in my life anymore, and Xavier O'Malley is twice the man you or my father could ever hope to be." As Sheriff Barnes and his deputies secured Harrington and his men for the journey back to Silverdale, Xavier drew Maggie slightly apart, his face grave as he took her hands in his. "When I saw them taking you," he said softly, "I felt as if my heart had been torn from my chest. The thought of losing you." He trailed off, emotion making his voice rough. "Maggie, I know it's too soon and perhaps too forward, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you. I think I have since the moment I saw you on that trail, trying to hide behind those pine trees." The simple declaration, spoken with such raw honesty, brought tears to Maggie's eyes. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not when it's truth." She reached up to touch his face gently. "I love you too, Xavier O'Malley. You showed me what true freedom means, not just the absence of constraints, but the presence of love and respect." Xavier's arms encircled her, drawing her close as his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of violence yet enfolded in the protection of Xavier's embrace, Maggie knew she had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. The journey back to Silverdale was a triumphant one, with Harrington and his men securely bound in the back of their own wagon, now driven by one of the sheriff's deputies. Maggie rode beside Xavier, their hands occasionally reaching for each other as if to confirm the reality of their reunion and newfound declarations. News of Harrington's capture and Maggie's rescue had preceded them, and the townsfolk of Silverdale gathered in the main street to witness the procession. Dr. Simmons rushed forward to check Maggie for injuries, his professional concern mixed with obvious relief at her safe return. "You'll stay at my house tonight," he insisted after confirming she was unharmed apart from some rope burns on her wrists. "Mrs. Simmons will be glad of the company, and it's more comfortable than that small room behind the office." Xavier reluctantly agreed to return to the ranch after extracting a promise from Sheriff Barnes to keep Harrington and his men under the strictest guard. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow," he told Maggie as they parted at the doctor's home. "We have much to discuss." That evening, after enjoying Mrs. Simmons's hospitality and recounting her ordeal for the concerned couple, Maggie retired to the guest room with a profound sense of gratitude and anticipation. The events of the past days had clarified what truly mattered to her: not wealth or social standing, but love freely given and received. She was brushing her hair before bed when a soft tap at the window startled her. Drawing aside the curtain, she found Xavier balanced precariously on the porch roof, grinning like a schoolboy caught in mischief. "Xavier," she gasped, opening the window. "What are you doing? I thought you went back to the ranch." "I did," he confirmed in a whisper. "But I couldn't sleep knowing you were here and I was there. Not after today." He held up a hand to forestall her protests. "I'm not coming in. I respect the Simmonses' hospitality too much for that. I just needed to see you to make sure you were really safe." The gesture, both romantic and respectful, touched Maggie deeply. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, reaching through the window to take his hand, "and very eager for tomorrow to arrive." Xavier's smile softened. "I have something important to ask you tomorrow, Maggie Oliver. Something I've been thinking about since the day you named Orion. Is it something I might want to say yes to?" she teased gently, though her heart raced at the implication. "I certainly hope so," Xavier replied, his gray eyes serious despite his smile. "Because it involves forever, if you'll have me." "Forever sounds perfect," Maggie whispered, leaning through the window to place a soft kiss on his lips. "Now go home before you break your neck on this roof, and I'll see you in the morning." With a final squeeze of her hand, Xavier disappeared into the darkness, leaving Maggie to drift into sleep with dreams of the future bright in her mind. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the world itself celebrated the triumph of love over fear and greed. Maggie dressed carefully in her best dress, the green one with pearl buttons, and arranged her hair simply but becomingly. Dr. Simmons greeted her with news that Sheriff Barnes had arranged for Harrington and his men to be transported to Denver for trial on charges of kidnapping, arson, and assault. "It seems Mr. Harrington's influence doesn't extend as far as he believed," the doctor noted with satisfaction. "The territorial marshal takes a very dim view of such crimes, regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or connections." Just as they finished breakfast, Xavier arrived, freshly shaved and dressed in what were clearly his best clothes. Mrs. Simmons exchanged a knowing look with her husband before tactfully suggesting they needed supplies from the general store, leaving Maggie and Xavier alone in the parlor. "You look beautiful," Xavier said softly, taking her hands in his. "You clean up quite well yourself," Maggie replied, admiring the way his blue shirt brought out the storm gray of his eyes. Xavier took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Maggie, I had planned to do this differently, take you back to Thinking Rock, make it perfect and romantic. But after yesterday, I realized that life is too uncertain to wait for perfect moments." He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Margaret Oliver, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy filled Maggie's eyes as she looked down at this good, brave man who had shown her the true meaning of freedom and love. "Yes, Xavier O'Malley. With all my heart, yes." Xavier's face lit with joy as he rose and gathered her into his arms, their kiss sealing the promise between them. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This was my mother's," he explained, opening the pouch to reveal a simple gold band set with a single diamond. "Uncle Thomas kept it for me, said I'd know when it was time to pass it on." As Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, Maggie felt the weight of history and promise it carried, not the crushing weight of expectation her father had placed on her, but the buoyant weight of love freely chosen and freely given. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Maggie and Xavier prepared for their wedding. Dr. Simmons insisted she continue working at the medical office, though he adjusted her schedule to allow time for wedding preparations and visits to the ranch, where Alina enthusiastically embraced the role of helping Maggie plan for her new life as Mrs. O'Malley. Word of Maggie's engagement reached Oroville, carried by the same stagecoach routes that had brought news of Harrington's arrest and pending trial. 2 weeks before the wedding, Alina Oliver arrived in Silverdale, this time with no need for secrecy. "Your father received a letter from Mr. Harrington's lawyers," she explained as she and Maggie sat in the parlor of Dr. Simmons's home. "When he learned what had happened, the kidnapping, the charges, he was furious, but not at Harrington." She sighed, a lifetime of disappointment in the sound. "He blamed you for the embarrassment to the Oliver name, for the business deal that collapsed when Harrington was arrested." "That sounds like father," Maggie said sadly. "Always concerned with appearances and profit, never with people's well-being." Alina reached for her daughter's hand. "His reaction made me realize I could no longer remain silent. For the first time in our marriage, I stood up to him. I told him I was proud of you for choosing your own path, for finding someone who values you for yourself and not your father's money." She smiled slightly at the memory. "He didn't take it well." "What happened?" Maggie asked, concerned for her mother's welfare. "He gave me the same choice he gave you, obedience or exile." Alina's chin lifted in an echo of her daughter's defiance. "I chose exile. I sold my mother's jewelry, the pieces he didn't know about, and bought a small house in Denver. It's modest, but it's mine." Her eyes twinkled with newfound independence. "And it has a lovely guest room for when you and your Xavier visit." Maggie embraced her mother, tears of joy mingling with sadness for the years lost to her father's domination. "I'm so proud of you, Mother." "And I of you, my brave girl," Alina replied. "Now, show me this ranch I've heard so much about, and introduce me properly to the man who has captured my daughter's heart." The day of the wedding dawned with the crisp clarity of early autumn in the mountains. The ceremony was held on the grounds of the Circle O Ranch, with Thinking Rock visible in the distance. Maggie wore a simple white dress that Alina had helped her make, with the locket from her mother around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. Xavier waited for her beneath an arch of aspens turning gold with the season, his face illuminated with joy as Dr. Simmons escorted Maggie to his side. The entire population of Silverdale seemed to have turned out for the occasion, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around, all gathered to celebrate the union of two people who had found in each other the freedom and love they both cherished. Sheriff Barnes stood as witness alongside Alina, while Reverend Thompson from the Silverdale Church officiated. The vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken with clear voices that carried across the Golden Valley. I, Xavier Thomas O'Malley, take you, Margaret Elizabeth Oliver, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish for all the days of my life. I promise to respect your independence even as I offer my support, to walk beside you rather than before or behind you, and to build with you a life of freedom, purpose, and joy. Tears shimmered in Maggie's eyes as she responded, I, Margaret Elizabeth Oliver, take you, Xavier Thomas O'Malley, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish for all the days of my life. I promise to be your partner in all things, to value the gift of your respect and return it in kind, and to create with you a home where love and freedom flourish together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter filling the ranch house and spilling onto the grounds. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, Xavier led Maggie away from the festivities toward the corral where a now thriving Orion frolicked alongside his mother. I have a wedding gift for you, Xavier said, guiding her toward a stall they hadn't visited. Inside stood a beautiful Palomino mare, her golden coat gleaming in the lantern light. Her name is Liberty. She's yours if you like her. Maggie stroked the mare's silky neck, moved beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift, not just a horse, but one whose name symbolized everything she had sought and found. She's perfect, Maggie whispered, turning to embrace her husband. Thank you for this and for everything. Thank you for choosing me, Xavier replied softly, cradling her face in his hands. For choosing us and the life we'll build together. As they stood there in the soft glow of the lantern, surrounded by the sounds of celebration and the quiet presence of the horses that had brought them together, Maggie reflected on the journey that had led her to this moment. From the confined luxury of her father's house to the open freedom of Xavier's ranch, from a life dictated by others to one shaped by her own choices, it had been a path of courage and discovery. In refusing her father's match, she had lost a family bound by control and expectation. In finding Xavier, she had gained a family built on love and respect. The trade, she decided as her husband's lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared joy, had been the wisest choice she would ever make. 5 years later, Maggie stood on the porch of the Circle O Ranch house, watching as Xavier led their 4-year-old son Thomas through the basics of handling a gentle pony. Beside her in a wooden cradle, their 6-month-old daughter Catherine slept peacefully, her tiny features a perfect blend of both parents. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Xavier's horse breeding program had gained recognition throughout the territory, while Maggie had established a small but respected medical practice, treating neighbors from miles around with skills honed under Dr. Simmons's guidance before his retirement. Eleanor visited regularly from her home in Denver, delighting in her grandchildren and in the contentment she found at the Circle O. She had never reconciled with Richard Oliver, who had died the previous winter, bitter and alone despite his wealth. The news had brought Maggie sadness for what might have been, but no regret for the choices that had led her away from his influence. As Xavier lifted Thomas onto the pony's back, the boy's face lit with excitement and pride. Maggie's heart swelled with love for her family, not just Xavier and their children, but the extended family they had created in Silverdale. Alina and Miguel, Sheriff Barnes and his wife, the Simmonses, and countless others who had embraced them with warmth and acceptance. Xavier looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day they met on that dusty trail, spoke of a love that had only deepened with the passing years. He said something to Thomas, then jogged over to join Maggie on the porch. "He's a natural," Xavier said proudly, wrapping an arm around Maggie's waist as they watched their son carefully guide the pony in a small circle. Just like his mother. And determined like his father, Maggie added, leaning into his embrace. Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out if we hadn't met that day on the trail? Xavier considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. Sometimes. But then I look at what we've built together, this ranch, our children, our place in this community, and I can't imagine any other path that could have led to such happiness. Maggie turned in his arms to face him, her heart full of the same certainty. Nor can I. When I left Oroville, I was seeking freedom from my father's control. I never imagined I would find so much more a love that expands freedom rather than limiting it. Xavier's kiss was as tender as it was passionate, a perfect expression of the partnership they had forged. As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had chosen, Maggie knew with absolute certainty that, in refusing her father's match and finding Xavier's heart, she had made the choice that defined not just her future, but her very self. The sun dipped toward the western mountains, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber. Thomas's delighted laughter mingled with the soft sounds of Catherine stirring in her cradle, creating a melody of family and home that was more beautiful than any Maggie had ever known. This, she thought as Xavier drew her close once more, was the truest freedom of all, the freedom to love and be loved, without conditions or constraints. And as the day faded into evening, stars beginning to appear in the vast Colorado sky above the Circle O Ranch, Maggie Oliver O'Malley offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the courage that had led her to this moment. This man. This life that was more precious than anything she could have imagined on that fateful day when she had chosen freedom over security, and found, in the end, both in the arms of a cowboy who had welcomed her not just into his home, but into his heart.